When were the Gospels written? The Gospels are our sources for knowing about the resurrection of Jesus, are they? The kind of sources that historians would want when trying to establish what? It probably happened in the past, I think. The answer to that question is no. When? Were the Gospels written? Well, they are not contemporary to the events they narrate. Scholars debate when the Gospels were reported, but by far, the most common datings are that Mark was written sometime around 65 or 70 AD, Luke and Matthew is about 15 TN, or 15 years later, John, maybe 10 or 15 years after John, maybe around the year 90 or 95. Matthew, Luke around 80 to 85. These are the dates that are taught throughout the universities and divinity schools and seminaries of North America and Europe. I think them to be suitable for reasons that I can give you if anybody wants to know if it's complicated arguments. If these dates are correct, it means that our earliest account of Jesus' resurrection is 40 years after the event. 40 years after the event. Well, Paul was writing before that. Yes, Paul was writing before that. Paul talks about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians. Well, that's 20 years after the event, so that's better. The Gospels give us the narratives. Paul refers to it 20. But there's a 20-year gap you don't have somebody who is there writing about it. Who wrote the Gospels? Second point, none of the authors were eyewitnesses. Paul himself indicates that he was not an eyewitness, and none of the Gospel writer was an eyewitness. People, of course, call the Bet Gospel books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, they call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because we don't know who wrote these books, and there's no point calling them Sam, Fred, Jerry, and Harry. I mean, they're people write to them we don't know who they were, and by they were anonymous. You might not think so because they have the title of the Gospel, according to Matthew. Whoever put that title on it was an editor later. The original books are all anonymous, written in the third person. Moreover, the followers of Jesus were Aramaic speaking peasants from Galilee, lower class men who were not educated in fact. Peter and John in Acts chapter 4 verse 13 is said to be illiterate. They couldn't read and write. Of course not, they were fishermen, and they didn't go to school. The vast majority of people in the ancient world never learned to read, let alone write, and their native language was Aramaic, and these books are written in Greek by highly educated, rhetorically trained writers who are skilled in Greek composition. Probably not disciples, and don't claim to be disciples. Where did these authors get their stories from? Well, if they were not disciples of Jesus, they must have heard the stories from somebody who listened to the reports from somebody who listened to the words of somebody who heard them from somebody's stories about Jesus, including his resurrection, had been in circulation year after year. A year from the time his disciples knew that he got killed and believed he got raised from the dead. They told stories to convert people. They improved the level. Sometimes they changed the story. Sometimes the stories got modified in the process of transmission over decades. Before anybody wrote the stories down, these stories are based on oral reports. What evidence do we have that have been in circulation for decides what happens to verbal statements in circulation year after year, decade after decade? They get changed. What evidence do we have? The stories about Jesus' death and resurrection change. You can read the stories yourself. Simply read Mark's account of Jesus' death and then read John's account of Jesus' death and make a list of everything that happens in both, and compare your lists. you will find that there are stunning differences. There are discrepancies. Let me give you just a list of rapid examples. What day did Jesus died on? That's a simple question. Luckily, we're told in both Mark and John. In Mark's Gospel, we're told that Jesus died the day after the Passover meal was eaten in Jerusalem. John tells us explicitly, chapter 19, verse 14, that Jesus died the day before the Passover meal was eaten on the day of preparation. For the Passover, that's different. He couldn't die both days. What about the time? According to Mark, he killed at 9 o'clock in the morning. According to John, wasn't he condemned to death until afternoon. John 19 verse 14. These are accounts that differ from one another. Did Jesus carry his cross the entire way to Golgotha, or did Simon of Cyrene too? Please take it. It depends on which gospel you read. Did both robbers mock Jesus, or did only one of them knocks him, and the other come to his defense? It depends on which the gospel you read. Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died, or was it after he broke? It depends on which gospel you read. I can give you the references for all of these if you need me to, or you can look them up yourself. I'm not making these up. Those are just differences about Jesus' death. What about differences in the accounts of his resurrection? Well, who went to the tomb on the third day? That Mary Magdalene go alone, or did Mary go with other women? It depends on which gospel you read. If with other women, how many of them were there? What were their names, and which ones were they? It depends on which gospels you read. Was the stone rolled away before the women got to the tomb or not? What did they see in the grave? Man, did they see two men, or did they see an angel? Fan, which gospel you read? What were they told to tell the disciples? Were the disciples supposed to stay in Jerusalem to see Jesus, or were they supposed to go to Galilee? Depends on which the gospel you read. Did the women tell anybody, or were they silent about it? Turns on which gospel you read. Did the disciples ever leave Jerusalem, or did they immediately did never leave, or did they leave and go to Galilee? Fans, which gospel did you read? In my conclusion, these are not reliable historical accounts. There are too many discrepancies. The charges are based on oral traditions that have been circulation for decades. Year after year, Christians tried to convert others by telling them stories to convince them that Jesus was raised from the dead, and they changed their stories while trying to convince people. These authors were not eyewitnesses. They're living Greek-speaking Christians. Many years after the fact, they're telling stories that Christians have been telling all these years. There was nobody is there taking notes. Some of the stories were invented, many were changed. For this reason, these accounts are not as helpful as historians would like, as historical sources that I've given you. So far, it is just kind of a child's play compared to the real problem of why historians cannot prove the resurrection. And this is what I want to spend my last 3.5 minutes on: the real problem. Mike and I agree that what the real problem. Historians try to establish what most probably happened in the past. That is the task of history. You can't prove the past, you can only give evidence for the past, and some evidence is more certain than other evidence. All the historian can show most probably what happened. What are miracles? Miracles, by definition, are the least probable occurrence of an event. If a gift was not least likely, it wouldn't be it would be a miracle if somebody could walk across your the lukewarm water in your swimming pool. That would be a gift. If the water was frozen, it would not be